everybody. Patrick Connor here, and welcome back to Knuckles and Gloves Boxing Radio. I'm here with my dude, Aris Pina, and we're talking boxing history. Just unfortunately, it's not the kind of boxing history we really enjoy talking about. As everybody knows, just this past week, marvelous Marvin Hagler, middleweight legend, all-time great middleweight, and very popular, just about everybody's favorite middleweight, passed away very unexpectedly. So that's what we're here to talk about. And Aris, how you holding up, man?
Better, man. I was pretty messed up when I heard the news on what was it, Saturday? We heard it. When the news first hit, I was at a bar with a friend, and I read it. Try to do a double take. Didn't know what I was reading, hoping it was wrong. Scroll through Twitter, confirm my instincts, and then I just got really sad really quickly because Hagler, was that type of guy that he's universally loved by everybody. You know what I mean? Like all boxing fans, all fighters, all everyone. He's the rare exception that no one has a bad word to say about him. He's just kind of universally respected and loved and adored. So when a person like marvelous Marvin Hagler dies, it's almost like losing a family member. You know what I mean? Like it really hurt me especially hard. I even know him particularly like him like that. I had a time to talk to him here and there and meet him at the Hall of Fame and stuff, but I'll get into it more later. But I had some connections with him because of the boxing gym that I trained out of where I first started, because he has ties to my hometown. Hagler had ties everywhere, everyone that everybody from a certain time period has a marvelous Marvin Hagler story, where they were when they watched the fight, or if they had a chance to meet him, or so on and so forth. So yeah, this was a tremendous loss for the boxing world and the world in general.
I think it's really it's pretty fascinating from a sociological perspective or whatever, that he went from a fighter that I'm not disputing at all. He definitely had to come up the hard way for a handful of reasons, or I should say, at least harder than some. And he went from being somebody who had to struggle for respect and somebody who was considered underrated, somebody who didn't get the respect they deserved, to being somebody who was just ridiculously popular. And it's totally anecdotal, obviously, on my part when I talk about stuff that I post on the boxing history pages. And it's not like to brag. It's just that I honestly do take these things as like a gauge of what's popular and what's not, what kind of like gets attention and what doesn't. And it was guaranteed. Anytime I posted about Marvin Hagler, it was going to get a fair amount of attention. Usually more than the vast majority of other fighters I would post about. So it's pretty crazy that he had gone from kind of one extreme to another. And sometimes I wonder why that is, like what changed, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that he's, he was very,
because he's the definition of a warrior, and he did it, and he did it on his own. He didn't do it with any help. He came up literally from absolute nothing of the bottom. He made $40 for his pro debut and at the gym at Brockton High School. That's as low as it gets. And to do that, to becoming one of the most adored fighters that ever walked the planet, is absolutely remarkable. But he did that without any help, without any fanfare, without the help of social media, without the help of whatever. He did it from just hard work and scraping along, and he had to demand and scrape and grouge to get that title shot, because there was no, he didn't, like I said, no one was there to try to do it. Like, he wasn't going to work with Don King. He was only working with the Petronelli brothers. It finally took like the helping of Bob Arum to push him over the edge to get that strap. And once he became champion, Hagler made sure damn well he was going to keep it, because he was one of those guys that wasn't favored by the world like that back then. He wasn't adored. He wasn't a 7-Up kid like Sugar Ray Leonard. He wasn't featured on TV. He wasn't adored like Muhammad Ali, others of that from that time period. Hagler was a guy that just had to fight for everything he gained.
That's true. And I mean, being that this is, I guess, primarily, we do the history stuff on the show, like that's definitely going to be a chunk of what we talk about today, is just kind of Hagler's history and coming up and how he got popular and his style, his career, all those kinds of things, and a bunch of the details behind the career. And like you said, some of the stuff that you learned interacting with him and some of your interactions and stuff like that. But one of the things I really wanted to talk about, and anybody who loves the history shows, they know probably by now, I just like doing obscure stuff, looking for little tidbits and details. I don't know. I just like that stuff. It's fun to me. And it's also fun to kind of impart that, pass that along. And this is something we're talking about the other day when we were talking about doing this show.
Mm-hmm.
Coming up, a lot of people, for a handful of reasons, I think primarily because he did fight in Philadelphia a number of times. He was promoted, or I should say he fought on fight cards promoted by J. Russell Peltz, who is a legendary Philadelphia area fight promoter. And so he was for a long time kind of lumped into that category of like the late 70s, early 80s Philadelphia middleweights, because he fought so many of those guys. And obviously that wasn't true. Especially if you heard him talk, you could definitely tell he was not from Philly. That dude was from Massachusetts. And so when you kind of go back to that and go, yeah, he's from Massachusetts, you start going into the local Massachusetts boxing scene and all of the involvement that he had in it and his history in that scene, and the fact that it's obviously not considered especially now, it's not really considered a fight hub, or like New England is not really considered a fight hub by any means. But
No,
there
they've
were
always had
times,
popular fighters, but nothing that's like considered, a hotbed of boxing like that. Absolutely.
right? It's not like L.A. or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not New York. But that being said, there's still a very lively amateur scene, and like to the point where there, at least back in this time in the early 70s and in the mid 70s, a lot of like crosstown rivalries in the amateurs for the especially the New England Amateur Athletic Union, the NEAAU, which is what Hagler wound up winning. I think it was 1973.
Great. Yep.
And that was like one of the ways that I came across that was I was just looking for photos of Marvin Hagler with hair. I just wanted to see some photos of this fool with hair, and so I found a handful of good photos of Marvin Hagler with hair. I showed you some of them, some I hadn't seen before, and so but going through his record, it was pretty remarkable that he was clearly thought of as somebody who was an up and comer in the scene, somebody who was to be looked to as kind of an example, but also, like I said, there were crosstown rivalry type action going on there. And I mean, you are Aris, well more equipped to talk about that kind of stuff going on in Massachusetts than I am.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You have a lot of, because Massachusetts and the cities that surround it are all really, really close. Like they're not, like driving distance wise, they're all relatively close to each other for the most part, unless you get like farther out to Boston. But like the southern New England scene, which you have New Bedford, Fall River, Brockton, a few other surrounding cities and towns, they all play, against each other, and they have big rivalries for football, basketball, other things like that. Like one of Rocky Marciano's favorite memories, it was said, that was scoring a whatchamacallit, he when he caught the ball from the other team, it's interception, excuse me.
Yeah.
I had a brain fart for a second. Yeah, he had when he caught an interception pass against New Bedford High and scored for Brockton High. So it's really, it was really big back then. But Hagler, it should be mentioned as well, is that not even originally from Massachusetts. He was originally from Newark, New Jersey. And
That's right.
He was living in Newark when the Newark riots were going down, and when things were, Newark was on fire. It was a very, very dangerous area, and his mom packed them up, and they moved over to Brockton. And the reason why Hagler got into boxing was he got beat up in a street fight against a future pro opponent. a guy by the name of Dornell Wigfield. And I think the story went that Hagler got into it. They went to a party together. Words were exchanged, maybe over a woman or whatever it may have been. They went outside, and when Hagler was taking off his coat, Wigfield cracked him. Hagler went down, realized his jaw was swollen, and, that was kind of it. So Hagler went to the gym to go learn how to defend himself, and first gym he went to was Vinny Vecchione's gym. Vecchione is primarily known now for his work with Peter McNeely in the 90s. He was the one that jumped into the ring super quickly when McNeely was in his infamous fight with Mike Tyson. And then also, I think he might have started in that Goofy Pizza Hut commercial afterwards when they were cashing out. But anyways,
it's too bad they couldn't get Snubby in on that action.
Yeah, seriously. For all the talk about Snubby and, giving him a shout out, stuff like that, the least you could have done for letting the man down was get him in on the Pizza Hut commercial. Yeah. Most of all, last but not least, Snubby. Jesus, dude. See, and that's why people love Hagler so much in the 80s, because look what we had in the 90s for boxing, bro. We had Peter McNeely. Talk about a drastic drop, okay?
Yeah, it was a poor replacement. Poor
yeah,
replacement.
I mean, there's a few other good fighters from New England during that time period. Ray Oliveira was doing his thing and making moves. Scott Pemberton came around the late 90s, early 2000s. Jason Pyers was making a run for the Olympic team.
Peter
so there was some.
Well, he wasn't from Massachusetts, but
New England area.
New England.
Yeah. Vinny Paz was still active back then. Like, there was still boxing, but it wasn't the type of thing like with Marvin Hagler. You know what I mean? Marvelous Marvin Hagler was a franchise on par with the Celtics. But back to his early days, he went to Vecchione's gym and just kind of sat there, but he didn't approach anybody. He just kind of sat down, just watched, listened, and just kind of observed things. But after staying there for a couple of days and no one came to talk to him, Vecchione didn't approach him, no one did. Hagler just packed his stuff up and went over to Petronelli's gym. And
yeah,
I can let you, give the history of the Petronellis or whatever, but the story goes that Hagler sat down over there, and Goody Petronelli, who was the head of the gym, came up to Hagler and said, "Hey, son, would you like to learn how to box?" Hagler said, "That's why I'm here," and rest is history.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Newark riots, and I mean, it sounded like that was pretty important in terms of like forming Hagler's attitude
toward white people back then.
Toward white people. And I mean, and that's not to give the later Alan Minter shit fuel, because I mean, what Alan Minter said was wrong. He might have been trying to say something another way, but regardless, what he said was wrong.
But just in case people who are going to listen are not aware exactly what he said, what was it that he said?
Well, so basically, if I'm not mistaken, and I'd have to look up the exact quote, but Alan Minter said something to the effect of, "I'd never let a black man come and take the title from me," or something like that.
Yeah.
It was something similar to that. And I mean, supposedly what he was saying and what his team was saying was that was a response to feeling as though Hagler didn't like white people and was acting that way while there. And whether or not that was the case, that's not how you respond to that shit.
Yeah.
So regardless, the point being, it's just a greater explanation for, I guess, Hagler's character and the way that he acted, and like you said, how he felt about white people. And that's even what it pretty specifically says in what the Petronelli said in that book, Four Kings by George Kimball, which is going to be one of the best sources for that kind of rivalry between those four guys.
He was there for all of them, which is incredible to think.
Exactly. And
he literally for every single one ringside.
A very coherent relayer of information, and a good writer, and somebody who repeated the stuff that he saw and said and stuff like that on video a number of times too. And anyway, so he had gone to the Petronellis, and he had this kind of stigma. And I think that when you take that into context, the vast majority of these boxing gyms are going to be run by a fucking old white dude. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is
Especially
what,
in Massachusetts.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not going to speak for people in Massachusetts, but what I have heard is that there's kind of a little bit of a racism problem. So
Depending on
I'm
where
not,
you're at, absolutely.
and
My
yeah,
own
and I'm not saying
opinion.
every single person in Massachusetts is a racist. I'm just saying that there, from what I have heard in major cities, there's some issues with race.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, you have a guy in Hagler who's coming from a situation where there were literal race riots, where he's coming from and where they're basically trying to escape. And then he's going to a place into these places that are dominated by older white dudes telling younger people what to do. And he was very mistrustful and it took him a while to basically listen to anybody. And supposedly what had happened is he had gone to a handful of gyms and he had pretty much just sat down and was like waiting to be approached, I guess.
Yeah.
And nobody was really approaching him because everybody was doing their own thing. And eventually when he had gone into the Petronelli's gym, they had gone up to him and were like, "Hey kid, you want to learn how to fight?" And he said, "Yeah." And one of the first promoters that they had gone to was a guy named Sam Silverman, who was
He's a legendary promoter in the thing.
Very well-known promoter in this area.
Goes back to the Marciano days and such.
Yep, and he had a lot of connections in boxing, a lot of connections, period. And he actually very soon before this, in like 1972-73, actually, Sam Silverman was trying to get George Foreman versus Oscar Bonavena going in Boston, like at Boston Garden, I think it was. And well, I'll give you a slight tidbit from my book, but Oscar Bonavena wound up pissing Sam Silverman off because, like, he did a number of promoters, because he would like enter into like multiple agreements and shit. And he would be fronted money and take all the fronted money, and then you'd wind up not going through with a fight and shit like that. And something similar wound up happening with Sam Silverman over a potential Foreman fight, which pissed Sam Silverman off. So anyway, this was like a year or two before getting involved with Marvin Hagler, and so that connection with Sam Silverman was really instrumental in kicking off Marvin Hagler's career. But like we said earlier, he was somebody who did not have an Olympic gold medal, like, for instance, a Ray Leonard. And the reason why that's relevant is because fucking everybody was compared to Ray Leonard at this time, because that's, 1976, like, you'd almost have to go through a nice little timeline with our shows, right? Like, we've talked about all of this stuff and it's very overlapping, but we've never gone through like a steady timeline. Right around this time, there was a drop-off in interest in boxing in the early 70s, a big drop-off, and networks were also becoming somewhat disinterested in boxing. And then when the 1976 Olympics hit and the 1976 team did so well, and Ray Leonard was, of course, kind of like the poster boy for this team, there was a massive surge in interest in boxing. And Ray Leonard, again, being the leader, the poster boy, the figurehead or whatever for this popularity, everybody was compared to him. It was kind of like how in the last handful of years everybody's compared to, well, he's no Floyd Mayweather or whatever, something like that. And so in a large way, Marvin Hagler was fighting against that, was fighting against these other fighters who had big amateur credentials or international amateur credentials, whereas he did very well in New England, but didn't really venture that far outside of New England as an amateur. So it was very instrumental in getting hooked up with a guy like Sam Silverman, who could promote this young dude, Marvin Hagler, and that's kind of how it all started.
But what's interesting should be noted too is that what Hagler went in the 73 AAUs, that was a national tournament. And that was the same tournament that it's mentioned in the Four Kings book that featured guys like from the team, Howard Davis, Leon Spinks, Sugar Ray Leonard, Aaron Pryor was there. a host of names, a host of really notable names that go on to either become champions in the sport or serve as trainers or whatever it may be. And Leonard didn't win the final the AAU title in that tournament. Leon Spinks was knocked out in that tournament. Howard Davis won his match and a few others, but it should be noted Hagler did win his match emphatically, and I think was known by most there as maybe the star of the tournament. And then he turned pro right after that. So he had a really promising amateur career that he left behind. When he was because basing off of winning the 73 AAUs, Hagler would have been looked upon as one of the top amateurs in his division in the country. And I mean, 73 to 76 is a long stretch, but from that period, if Hagler kept on competing as an amateur, who knows if he could have made the team or not, or definitely would have been a running contender for it. But with that being said, who knows how his career would have ended up if he had turned pro later around 76 as opposed to when he did in 73,
Right.
Because he might have been burned out from, fighting so long as an amateur or so on. I don't.
Right. No, yeah. And I guess I skipped around in trying to kind of tell the larger story.
No,
But
totally. No,
but I mean, it's this earlier part of Marvin Hagler's career,
Mhm.
pretty damn important as far as what he wound up became and what he wound up becoming and what he was known for being and whatnot, and especially his style too.
And Silverman struggled to promote him. He did not have an easy time with him because guys didn't want to fight Hagler. And I think to the point that didn't Silverman want to try to make him not be southpaw anymore?
And it sounded like there were a lot of gym discussions as far as what he should be doing or shouldn't be doing stylistically, whether he should be southpaw, because it might be avoided as a blah blah blah. It's a long winding story, but actually it's funny too because, and this is something the book mentions, and this is going right alongside there. Tony Petronelli was in the same gym, and he kind of overshadowed Hagler for much of their time. There's same time spent concurrent in the gym because Tony was a pretty polished fighter and had been in there for a long time and meshed well with the Petronellis, obviously. And he was, I think, a little bit more decorated as an amateur. So he was considered somebody who was maybe a little bit more promising as a pro. That might have affected how much energy was actually put into promoting Hagler too. But needless to say, you go through his early pro career when a lot of these other guys, I mean, these Ray Leonards, the Spinks brothers, a lot of these guys were famous even well before that 1976 tournament, because they just were. They had already been around the national scene for a number of years. And a lot of people forget that even though it's not to say there weren't fighters turning pro earlier or younger back in the day, but it wasn't uncommon for a dude to be turning pro at 24 or something like that because he had a longer amateur career or whatever. And anyway, long story short, Hagler just came up a different way than a lot of these dudes.
Completely. And he wasn't coddled or babied either coming up. Early on, we were talking about this fight the other day. Early as 1974, he was thrown in with Sugar Ray Seals, who was an undefeated Olympic gold medalist from the 72 games, which created a very unique environment because it was held at a TV station. I think it was a WNAC TV studio in Boston, amongst a few dozen fans, probably maybe 30 people in there or so, just kind of on bleachers. And there's a big ring in the middle with a couple of cameras, and yeah.
It's crazy as hell too, because I mean, I guess the setup doesn't really look that different from what you'd see in a ballroom or whatever, because they got lights and shit.
Uh-huh.
But it's the lights look like they're a foot over their heads, man. It's crazy. In the photo, if you go to the Box Rec page, the photo that you showed me, and then you look in the background, and there's this welcome back Cotter motherfucker with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, dude, it's Jack Black sitting over there or something. It's crazy. It's literally it's a pretty gnarly environment. But then
no footage of the fight ever came out too, which is kind of interesting considering that it took place in a TV studio. You would think.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's pretty crazy. I've never seen any footage of it, and I've never
No,
known any
I looked
footage.
it up the other day to try to see if anything came up, and everyone said the same thing. There's never been footage. Even Seal said, no, there's no footage of their first two fights. The only one that it exists or it's come to light is the first round knockout loss right before he
Yeah.
won the belt, before he fought for the title.
Yeah, and one of the anecdotes that according to Ray Seals, and this is I can't remember where he said it because I have it somewhere in an article and I didn't think to really, firsthand source this shit, but one of the things that I remember reading was that Ray Seals claimed that he was basically lured into this fight
Bamboozled.
thing. Yeah, hoodwinked, run
Yeah.
amok, and he thought that this fight was going to be an exhibition or that there was some sort of arrangement, I guess, and it turned out that there definitely was not, and the fight was 100% legitimate, and he was not ready or something like that. I mean, that sounds a little bit bunk. I don't know. Who knows, dude? It's really impossible to say. But regardless, that was kind of his story, and
I
uh,
read an account where he said when he walked into the studio, it was freezing. He said that he was like freezing and he couldn't warm up or anything. Like it was freezing in there, and then they told him, oh yeah, by the way, this fight that it's gonna be an exhibition. Actually, it's a real fight. And then when he came out there and he was like stone cold, and then he said Hagler came out and Hagler was dripping with sweat, and he said
yeah.
that's when he realized he was in trouble.
Well, and on top of that, it's Hagler.
Yeah.
So it's like whether it's real or an exhibition. I mean, might be going through some pain tonight, but I don't know. That was his account
Right.
anyway. But
That
it's
just
a
shows
pretty
you the type of how Hagler came up because he
yeah.
had to fight Sugar Ray Seals. He fought him again in a rematch. He went to Tacoma, Washington to fight him in Seals' hometown to fight that, and he got a draw out of it, which will tell you that he probably deserved to win that fight. Um, moving on with him, eventually Sam Silverman was getting annoyed with like trying to build Hagler because he said he was too good and he couldn't get him fights or whatever. So the story goes that um, Goody Petronelli and them said, "We'll find an opponent, that you think will beat him." And that's when he handpicked in 1975. Hagler fought the 30-0 Johnny the Mad Baldwin, who was a 1968 Olympic bronze medalist, and a bad, really tough fighter from Houston, Texas. And he was handpicked to beat Hagler, and Hagler thrashed him when they fought. There is actually a little bit of footage online of it on YouTube. There's like highlights of their fight accompanied by some really bad music, but you can find it.
That was right when he headed to Philly, pretty much.
That was
You
right
know,
before he went to Philly, and that's when it started. Yep.
he was so right around this time. I mean, there've been kind of like little handfuls of like golden eras or whatever for various different divisions. Like a golden era for heavyweights or whatever would be like the 1960s, early 1970s. Like a golden era for light heavyweight would be like the early 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, stuff like that. Like another good era for middleweights would have been, I don't know, 30s and 40s. Both had pretty good middleweights.
They
Point
did.
being,
Even though it's confusing as shit, it was a very good era.
yeah, it was very yeah, with Marcel Phil and all these
Yeah.
dudes, it was like there was a big round robin with who really deserved the title and blah blah blah. But
What do
regardless,
you
there was
think of
still
Munzon's era?
yeah, there was a lot of at least Monzon fought a number of like kind of like second rate European dudes. Sorry to put it that way, but just dudes who are not. They just happen to be European. They just were not that good, in my opinion. Most of them. I mean, at least looking at them, looking at them against Monzon, part of that was that he was very skilled and he was a very difficult style to fight. Very technical, very jab heavy. Somebody who was going to be able to tie you up and stuff like that, but the vast majority of these like European junior middleweights who were coming up and middleweights were like they were not on par with him skill wise. So it was okay, but not super great. I think that he kind of missed out on the better
Era that
middleweights
was
from
coming.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sure, that should be mentioned too. That because sometimes you hear, not often, from uneducated people once in a while, you'll hear something like, "Oh, Hagler should have had a title shot as far back as when Munzum was champion." Like,
Mm,
that's
eh,
pushing it. Hagler wasn't quite
yeah.
ready here in 74, 75. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
about all that. Yeah. Well, and I think the fact that he was he was losing to Bobby Watts, and these were not like blowouts or anything like that, but Willie the Worm and losing to Bobby Watts, they also were not ridiculously elite fighters. They were good fighters. So I think that just the fact that he was going close with some of these guys kind of should dispel that a little bit, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
exactly. Hagler was still coming up at that point. Munzun was nearing the end of his career. He wasn't going to defend against a guy like Hagler regardless because he was just looking for a cash out. And yeah, if anyone that Hagler had a chance to fight before it was Enterfermo, it would have been someone like Hugo Coro or yeah, probably Coro. I'm not even sure if he was even the title picture when Rodrigo Valdez became full champ. So
Yeah, it's I don't think the timing was really there. I
yeah,
think that's a
they,
little
they
bit
just
of
missed
a
each other by a couple of years.
yeah, I think that's just a little bit of a stretch from the pro Hagler camp. And I love Hagler too. But yeah, the point being that right around this time was when he had started kind of making more regular appearances around Philadelphia. And like I had mentioned earlier, when Jay Russell Peltz had kind of got a hold of him, he was a promoter that was coming up in the Philadelphia area himself. He was fairly new, and he was somebody who clearly saw the value of putting on regular fights featuring a number of these middleweights who were, there was just a number of them, either from Philadelphia or from around Philadelphia, or who had emigrated to Philadelphia or whatever. Like I said, Cyclone Hart, Willie Monroe, a number of these dudes were just good fighters who were either fighting in Philly or around Philly regularly. And bringing Marvin Hagler there was a pretty good idea, obviously, and made for some pretty memorable tangles that got the Philly crowd worked into a frenzy, and also built up a bit of a fan base for Hagler for when he came back and was fighting back around Boston.
Very much so. And Peltz had a chance, I think, to actually have a piece of Hagler's contract at one point. That the Petronellis asked if he was interested in working with him, and Peltz said something to the effect of Hagler can't even beat my best. He can't even beat the best middleweights out of Philadelphia. What am I going to do with him? What can I do with him? And he said that was like the biggest regret he ever had.
Crazy. Yeah, I mean, into somebody like Russell Peltz is somebody who you should obviously listen to on the subject, because he had involvement in a lot of those Philly light heavyweight brawls, and specifically Matthew Saad Muhammad. But he had a bit of experience in the boxing scene around this area around this time, needless to say.
And Hagler went. He has to be mentioned too. When Hagler went to Philly, these were guys that were highly avoided, and just as much as Hagler. Like, he needed to fight them because there was no one else to fight. No one was trying to actively look out to fight Hagler, risk themselves to fight him. And no one was actively trying to fight Willie Monroe. No one was actively trying to fight Bobby Watts, Eugene Hart, so on and so forth. So Hagler said, fuck it, I'm going to go to Philly and fight these guys myself. And the first fight with Bugaloo Watts, there is footage of that fight. And Hagler was arguably robbed in that one. It was a very close one. And then when he fought the first fight against Willie the Worm, that's the one that there's no footage of because there was a snowstorm or something that they said, and that like delayed all the television, cameras from getting there, and no one was able to film it. But Hagler, readily admitted up until the end that he lost that fight. That was the only fight that he admitted he lost because Monroe boxed his ears off that night. That was Willie Monroe's best night of his career, and he put it on Hagler. But Hagler persevered. He came back. He ended up stopping Cyclone Hart soon after that. Which was basically like the last straw. If he had lost that fight, that would have been it. Who knows what happened with his career? But he ends up stopping Hart. Subsequently knocked out Willie the Worm in 2 rematches after that. And it says something for Hagler that he went back to Philly each time to fight Monroe and knock him out that way. And then eventually he got back at Bobby Watts as well. So Hagler just was still coming up. It was a guy that was steadily grinding and making that case as the unofficial, middleweight champion, or a guy the uncrowned champion, because while guys like Coro were meddling and, fighting people like Ronnie Harris and Rodrigo Valdez was slowly finishing up his career and such, Hagler was there grinding. He was fighting the Philly, the guys from Philly. He was fighting guys like Chris Finnegan, other really tough contenders, and he was beating the hell out of all of them. There wasn't a guy in Hagler's path at that point in the late 70s that Hagler didn't beat the hell out of that got in the ring with him. Like, Hagler was an absolute machine. So it got to the point there that was almost like a joke that Hagler wasn't going to get a title shot. It wasn't it just, got to the point that one wasn't going to happen. That's when Bob Arum, I believe, came into the picture to help out.
You actually make a good point too. That's like kind of fair that I wanted to go back on, that a lot of those Philadelphia middleweights were like avoided, and that was a big reason why they had a bunch of losses on their records and why they like weren't particularly impressive sometimes, because of their schedules. It's obviously going to be different when you have a lot of financial support throughout your career, like the aforementioned Ray Leonard would and stuff like that, when you've been taken care of, or versus when you're having to fight every 6 weeks for financial reasons, or you're having to fight much more difficult and much more grimy opponents in shittier situations. So that's totally a fair point, and I don't want to belittle any of those Philly dudes for that reason. But yeah, Bob Arum, to his credit, and Top Rank had, I think that if you go through and you start looking at a lot of, and this is a credit to the promoters at the time too, not just Marvin Hagler, but and other fighters, some of the gates that these guys had been drawing, they had, like, just the word of mouth. A number of these fights, they knew that Marvin Hagler was a fighter that you wanted to go see. They knew that, I mean, Benny Briscoe was definitely toward the end of his career at this time, but he was still fairly popular. Ray Seals was a guy that was popular, but, kind of known at this point that he was not at the level that a number of other kind of like Olympic gold medalists would be. But point being, they had gotten popular. They had gotten Bob Arum's attention, and I think that he knew much better than a lot of these other promoters and whatnot how to capitalize on this regional kind of popularity.
Yeah, for sure. And Hagler had a few fights that he had to before he was able to get a title fight that he had to make sure, Arum, when he was like, all right, well, if I'm going to use you, I'm going to see how you operate. So he put him on the undercard, I think, of I want to say it was Coro against Enterfermo. And that's when he put him against Norberto Cabrera. And, Hagler beat the hell out of him and then stopped it. And soon after that fight, that's when he had the title fight against Vito in his first fight. And everybody thought when Hagler fought him that Hagler would finally, coronate, stuff like that. Enterfermo was a good fighter, no doubt. A hell of a fighter. Very, very tough, fearless, would get in there, give everybody a rough night, stay on your chest, grind away. Just not a fun guy to fight, but at the same time, it should have been easy pickings for Hagler because it should have played right into Hagler's hands. And Hagler had a really tough time that night. He might have frozen a little bit his first major fight under the spotlight like that, and a few other factors, but whatever it was, Enterfermo was able to scrape away with a draw that most people thought Hagler won. But it should be, in my opinion too, though, it wasn't
It was close.
It was close. It wasn't. I thought Hagler edged it, but it's not like, hey, Hagler won every single round. This was one of the worst decisions in boxing history. Far from it.
Well, so you kind of mentioned this, yeah, but like Marvin Hagler fought on the undercard of what's that?
Oh no, the Coro fight, yeah.
Yeah. So they fought in Monaco and Fontville, Monaco, where, I mean, dude, I'll just fucking be plain here. a number of these times when promoters are taking fights to exotic locales, that shit is a fucking tax scam. It has nothing to do with trying to like enrich the local economy. It has nothing to do with trying to like introduce blah blah blah. It's just a tax scam.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Monaco. It's some big ass resort, blah blah blah. So Vito Antuofermo is fighting Hugo Coro for the middleweight title, and then on the undercard, Hagler defeats Norberto Cabrera, but has like not a difficult time. He dominates, but he's just like doesn't look super impressive.
It's just like a gym workout.
Yeah, I mean, it's he winds up making the dude quit in his corner, and it wasn't. He didn't wind up knocking his block off, so people, I guess, got a little pissy because he didn't knock his block off.
Did Howard Cosell lead a cheerleading squad about him sucking?
Yeah, and supposedly Mike Katz, where is Mike Katz anyway, dude? Is he still right?
No, I think he passed away, actually. Is that Mike Katz?
Michael Katz? I don't think so. Not that I know of.
No, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I was thinking of some promoter, for whatever reason, Arcturus or something like that. I don't know why I got them confused. Mike Katz is still very much alive.
Yeah, he's probably still rocking his little neck brace somewhere.
Yeah, but he's still kicking, absolutely.
Walking around with his cane and neck brace. But in any case, supposedly, according to Four Kings, Mike Katz said something complimentary of Marvin Hagler, and Howard Cosell was like, "What in the hell are you talking about?" And basically talked it down, and there was some discontent, supposedly, with Marvin Hagler then getting a shot at Vito Antuofermo. And anyway, yeah, they went on to fight, and like you said, I thought that it's generally accepted that Hagler got blind robbed. He should have been the champion. I mean, he probably should have won the fight. But it was not. It was a difficult fight. It was kind of like a very physical fight. He did not have an easy time whatsoever.
And Antuofermo actually came on at the end. Like it was a close fight. And Hagler, like you said, Hagler should have got the decision. But Antuofermo made it tough for him. And I think that reaffirmed people's opinions that were kind of sketchy on Hagler back then too. Oh, look at this. He's supposed to be like a juggernaut, and he couldn't.
Exactly.
He wasn't able to overcome Vito right now, exactly. Like that type of thing. Because he didn't get an automatic title shot right away again. He had to fight a bunch of times before he was able to get Minter.
Yeah, well, exactly. It was not. It's just not the way that a lot of people retell the story, that Hagler should have been champion, blah, blah, blah. It was fairly close, but he was made to then get back in with a handful of dudes, including Bobby Watts and Lucif Hamani. Lucif Hamani had only one defeat at that time, and Hagler straight pitched him out of the ring, too.
So, yeah, that's a vicious knockout. That was the knockout that people were hoping that he was going to produce against Antuofermo.
If he had, put forth that kind of, and Vito Antuofermo wasn't that kind of fighter. He wasn't going to be pitching Antuofermo out of the ring quite like that anyway. But yeah, no, that was a really big performance that probably helped again earn him another title shot. And finally, that's what we were talking about earlier when I mentioned against Alan Minter. There was a big build-up. They were taking the fight over to London at Wembley, and supposedly in the promotion of that fight, some shit went down.
Yeah, lots of it. And the thing is, Minter was another guy who came up tough. Another former Olympian. He had a few losses on his record and stuff, but he was a really, really tough, a really proud fighter. Like you said, definitely used the wrong choice of words for that, and rightfully so, got punished for his actions. But Minter also had a lot to prove as champion, because when he first won the belt against Antuofermo, he won that in a very controversial fashion. They had a fight at Caesar's Palace, and I think it was a split decision. But the thing that was like majorly wrong about it was that the judge from England voted, I think, every single round for Minter except maybe like one. He scored it like 14-1 or something ridiculous. That just made it look like an out and out like screwing. So right away, he already had business to take care of. Hagler wasn't going to get another shot after that, because now those two had, controversy and business to take care of from there. So Minter fought him in a rematch and stopped him on cuts. But once he stopped him there, now he figures, okay, to be sure he's not a cheese champion or whatever, maybe I have to fight Hagler. And Hagler at this point now is hungrier than ever because Hagler has convinced himself, and probably rightfully so, if he's not able to pull his fight off, whether it's even if it would be like a technical job because of a headbutt cut or something like that, he wasn't going to get another title shot. Like this was going to be it. This is, one and done. Like this will be a second one, and he's going to be done from this. And when he went in there, like it was a tough fight. The first round, Minter came out there and really was throwing with Hagler, and there was some really good exchanges. But once Hagler caught a beat on him and, let his combinations go, Minter's skin wasn't able to hold up whatsoever.
Well, and Alan Minter had a history. He had been stopped like 5 times or something like that on cuts. So, and Vito Antuofermo also had a history of swelling and cutting and shit like that too. But another thing about Alan Minter was that he was this time he wasn't that young, but he's young looking. He was a good looking dude. He was fairly well promoted. He was pretty popular. He had a bunch of endorsements at this time. And also he had risen to some measure of fame or infamy, I guess, too, because a couple years before that, he had fought a dude named Angelo Jacopucci in Italy and wound up for the vacant middleweight or European middleweight title and wound up actually killing Angelo Jacopucci with a brutal knockout later in the fight. And locally, the doctor who was like the Italian doctor wound up going on trial and shit like that. And anyway, it was a little bit of a scandal, and it made the news. But he had also been around the middleweight division for a number of years before that. He was pretty well known. But I mean, Hagler was on his ass. He actually, I thought Minter started the fight pretty well.
He did. He came out there, guns a-blazing, for sure.
He did a pretty good job in the first round, and he seemed as though he might actually be able to kind of like get the drop on Hagler for a minute there, but his skin was not going to hold up. That was the point, is that his face just totally fell apart once Hagler started connecting. And to his credit, Hagler was piecing his ass up.
Yeah.
It was not a situation where he was just kind of barely catching him and cut open his eyebrow and it wound up getting stopped, and it was unfortunate. He was tipping his ass up, dude, and it opened up his face, and what wound up happening was totally fucking disgraceful, to the point where people literally are apologizing about it to this very day. Apart from Alan Minter's pre-fight comments, which were shitty, then after Marvin Hagler's declared the winner on cuts because Minter's face is just an absolute wreck, people start throwing all manner of rubbish into the ring, cans, bottles, chairs, all sorts of shit, to where the Petronellis and Hagler's entire team are like a fucking Thunderdome over him, covering him, trying to make sure he doesn't get hurt, and then have to escort him from the ring. There's ringside officials scurrying under the ring because they're like, holy shit, we're going to die. And it was a riot. It was pretty awful. And it's one of those kind of black eye for boxing type of thing days in British boxing that they still talk about.
Absolutely, man. It was in the Four Kings book. They mentioned whether it was Kimball or someone that was on hand for that fight, but they said that before the fight they noticed skinheads were walking up the bleachers and they were holding cases of beer. They were selling beer by the cases for this fight, and they knew at that point.
That's never a good idea.
I mean, no, I didn't even know that was a thing.
I'm a drinker, and that's never a good idea.
So they were selling cases of beer, and they were watching these guys hold the beer on their shoulders or on their heads and walk up multiple cases. And the guy, the person said to themselves, I just know this is gonna be this is just not good. This is not good. This is not good. This is bad news.
It was I can't remember whatever year it was. It was in 1981 or some shit like that. the 5-cent beer night at Dodger Stadium wound up coinciding with the free bat night or some shit, and that shit didn't happen again. Needless to say, that was after.
Wait, they gave you a free baseball bat?
Yeah, it was like a mini bat or something.
Still,
I don't remember what the exact circumstances were. I just remember reading it years later and being like, well, that's ridiculous. Point being, when you mix alcohol with like anything, especially a sporting event, it's like a recipe for disaster. And then when you inject an issue of race, well, I guess I don't want to say inject, like there's already an issue of race, but then when you emphasize it from that perspective, it's just fuck, dude.
Yeah.
It led to something awful. And I think one of the worst things about it, obviously, apart from the potential injury or death that could have arisen from it, was that Hagler didn't get to fucking just celebrate winning the middleweight title that he had worked several years to win, and was, felt avoided, felt as though he was working towards something that he deserved. Finally got it and couldn't even celebrate it because he was getting pelted with shit. So, that's why people still feel as though it's shameful and why it's still talked about that way. 'Cause that's fucked up, man.
Completely. Hagler, I don't even think was announced as the winner in the ring.
They didn't even get that far. It was like immediate. He was, if you look at well, there's video too, but you can even see it in the photos. Right as they announce him as the winner, he celebrates. He falls to his knees.
Yep, and he puts
with his arms out, and he's like, "Yes." And then it's literally like seconds later.
You see one of the beer cans
the ring.
Yeah.
And then it's like a couple happen, and it's like the Petronellis are like, that's okay. But then they start seeing tons of shit, and they're like, oh shit, and they cover them up. It's like instantaneous, man. It's fucked up, man. Just
it's incredible. And again, that's Hagler. It almost like just another bitter pill for Hagler to swallow. He's like, I'm finally champion. Right. I don't even get a chance to celebrate it. Like, he still gets no respect. I don't even get a chance to celebrate, and I'm not getting the accolades I need. Instead, this bullshit happens.
And funnily enough, too, Bernard Hopkins used to talk about Hagler, especially earlier in his career, for obvious reasons, because it kind of changed once he went corporate. But earlier in his career, Hopkins used to talk about Hagler all the time. And I mean, you have this a guy in Hopkins who was always feeling as though somebody was against him, or he was denied something that he was deserved, or that somebody was after him, somebody was out to get him, somebody's trying to hoodwink him, somebody's trying to do this. And he literally kind of almost seemed to adopt that type of personality or outlook from Marvin Hagler. And that's not to say that either of them didn't have reasons for feeling that way. It's just that they definitely looked at it like as if everybody was their enemy. And in a lot of ways, that shit was true. And especially with Hagler, because like we've said, he had to come up the hard way. And even when he accomplished some shit, it was like he still wound up getting punished for accomplishing it.
Yeah, and so at that point, Hagler's saying to himself, all right, now I'm the champion. I just need to go about and command the respect. I want the money, the accolades, everything else that comes with it. But now that he's champion, first off, it comes off with this fiasco. So now it's not so much that he became champion, that the focus is being leaned toward what happened of the after the fight. And now he's trying to figure out, okay, where can I move now an avenue for a big fight? Because at that point in 1980, there wasn't a big fight on the horizon to be a big super fight for Hagler. Like, the super fights were in different divisions, and the middleweight wasn't one of them. So Hagler had to go about, defending his title until he was able to get a title. Either wait till, a viable fight was able to come, like something really big when, eventually a guy would be able to move up. And for a guy to be able to do that back then, when it was actually pretty normal for guys to move up or down, to challenge for division titles and stuff like that, was pretty, it was interesting.
Well, there were enough kind of junior middleweight who could come up at this time too. Yeah. And it's, funnily enough, that's another way in which it kind of compares with Bernard Hopkins, I guess, And Carlos Monzon, they were all in kind of similar positions where they could just dominate the division that they were in, and it wound up being that the guys just below them also had the opportunity to kind of bring some shit up.
Terry
But
Norris, I guess, so that to a degree as well.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, some of the division though was well, how do you think Hagler's division rates in terms of quality?
I mean, there was really good fighters in his division around in the 80s, but no one that you would say was like a bona fide, like, killer, you know what I mean? But they were really good fighters and a lot of really solid contenders that probably could have won a strap or two in a different era, in a different division, especially in like Hagler, the middle of Hagler's reign. Like, for instance, Folio Bell, he ended up becoming a super middleweight champion eventually. He was a tough customer. A guy that he's not thought of as one of Hagler's toughest challengers, but he's still a tough name nonetheless. Caveman Lee probably wouldn't have become a champion in any era, but was still a tough guy and made for good fights. Tony Simpson was a hell of a fighter. He was a contender long after Hagler was after middleweight champion. He was still plugging along, and a guy that in another era in the 90s or so probably would have won a strap at middleweight or super middleweight or so. You know what I mean? Um, and that's just like that tier. If you get to guys like Mustafa Hansho, who was a really, really tough contender and went around and gave everybody hell and even gave Hagler a tough time his first fight, you have him. Wilfred Sipien was a really, really tough guy himself. And obviously, you move on to the Beast Mugabe later on, but the middleweight division was tough back then. Probably kind of, I don't know, it's a filled with an era with a lot of guys who, not sure if they would have been dominant champions, but easily would have picked up a strap at an era not, with Marvin Hagler in it.
Yeah, I will say there were a handful of guys that I think maybe the telltale thing was that they were all struggling against each other for the most part. There weren't a whole lot of them standing out among each other, but then there were dudes like Caveman Lee who were putting up. He might not have been a champion in many other eras or anything like that, but he was a tough dude and he was putting up a tough fight to a number of other contenders. But then Hagler wiped him out.
Yeah, Wilfred Sipien was the same thing. He had beat Frank Fletcher. He had a really, really tough fight with Mustafa Hamsho. I think he beat Curtis Parker. He had a lot of, really, really good fights, and he could hit really, really hard. And Hagler wiped him out in 3. Look at Juan Roldan. Probably Roldan might be the toughest of Hagler's title challengers outside of Mugabe. And Roldan, for the most part, besides Hagler and Hearns, beat the hell out of every other middleweight of that era that he fought. So.
Yeah, I will say, yeah, I was gonna say, well, it wasn't a very strong middleweight era. It might not have been the best middleweight era, but
exactly.
there were some fighters they were good fighters.
Tough guys, yeah, really, really tough, really rugged guys who would have been probably more successful in other eras that just wasn't run by a madman like Hagler, who was his single purpose was just dominating his division. He had no worry. He didn't think about moving up to light heavyweight to challenge a guy like Marvin Johnson, who was active during his era, or Saad Muhammad, Michael Spinks, whoever else might have been champion. He didn't want to do that. He didn't worry about going down or doing anything. He was going to be the king of his division, and the middleweight division being one of the glamour divisions of boxing, and one of the original 8, and always holding that type of prestige, almost on par with the heavyweight division. Hagler was going to be the king of it, and he was proud of it. And eventually, with by him plugging along and fighting these tough contenders and beating them over and over, somebody was going to finally bite and move up and challenge him, and that guy ended up being Roberto Duran.
Yep, and it wound up being a very surprisingly good and competitive fight that Marvin deserved to win, but nonetheless, he did not have an easy time. Now, granted, a number of these fights, though, where he had a really difficult time, his last, 5, 6, 7 fights were fights that he had kind of a tough time in one way or another, but that was literally the end of his career. And also, something that you just said is something we've talked about a number of different times, and it's kind of like, I guess you could ask the question, well, what do you value more? Do you value, I guess, what's probably more valued today, which is running around getting all sorts of fucking belts in different divisions and being an X division champion to the point where you could say, what is it? You got Adrian Broner's like a 4 division or something, like a 6-time 4 division or something. You got, Tank Davis is like a 4 division or some. I don't even know, dude. It doesn't even matter. The point is that there's one set of people who feel as though that's where it's at. Different divisions holding multiple titles, blah blah blah. But then I guess the other argument is domination over a period of time. Longevity, sticking with it, whatever. And that's obviously the camp that Marvin Hagler was in, where he was as an amateur a couple years back before he turned pro. He was weighing it at 155, 156 pounds.
Yeah.
So there was really no change over the course of almost 20 years. He was still, for his very last fight against Ray Leonard, 158 and a half pounds. So that in itself, I guess, is an achievement and impressive. And I guess it just really depends on what you value or whatever. But the point is that he really cleaned out a division. He cleaned out the division even before he was champion, really. He did a lot of work to clean out the division before he was even champion. And so by the time he got to a lot of the bigger money fights and finally faced a Roberto Duran, that was a massive fight and wound up being a great fight too. The problem was that a lot of people, I think, saw that and felt as though a guy coming up, a former lightweight in Duran, who was able to take it to Hagler the way that he did and do as well as he did. At this point, Hagler was popular, but not a megastar.
Exactly. And this was his first mega fight.
And so it was, I think, to many a disappointment that he didn't do much better.
Well, absolutely. It was one of those fights that Duran, even though Duran was having his renaissance in 1983, with the Davey Moore fight and stuff like that, it was still looked upon as a big leap to challenge Marvelous Marvin Hagler, like the rampaging middleweight champion who just kind of destroys everybody that he fights. And people thought, okay, well, Duran's had a good comeback and everything, but this will be his last hurrah. And kudos to him stepping up to him, but Hagler should handle him accordingly. But Duran was one of those type of guys who, I'm not even sure, people realize the brilliance of how great he was, but obviously from the Sugar Ray Leonard fight, and other past fights and stuff, but it really, I think he reminded everyone once again of how brilliant he was because he was a guy that was able to hang with Hagler, you know what I mean? Instead of just people thinking, okay, this is going to be his doom, he's going to get blown out there. No, he was savvy enough that he was going to be, it wasn't going to be a blowout regardless. And he did. He confused Hagler. Hagler also didn't try to come at him. He wasn't, trying to seek and destroy to knock his head off. He approached Duran with caution first. It's his first big fight. That's, it's on pay-per-view in certain locations. It's closed circuit all over the country and sold out crowd. It's a big event. And Duran was on his A game that night, and Hagler really struggled. After the 13th round, Hagler was still actually behind on 2 cards, and the 14th and 15th, he really pushed it on to edge that fight, but he came close. A lot of people will say that was a closer fight than the Leonard fight was. Some people will say that, ones that really hate Leonard.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of, as we've talked about, today, there's a lot of revisionist, just a lot of making shit up when it comes to, and we talk about this somewhat frequently, pretty much anytime we talk about history, really, but there's a lot of just kind of misconceptions and rumors and stuff like that get pushed forth as fact and blah, blah, blah. But Point is, Duran obviously did very well, unexpectedly well, against somebody like Hagler, who at worst was a punishing fighter who might not take your head off and take you out early, but he was going to make it a very difficult fight for you over the long run. He was going to constantly pressure your ass. And Roberto Duran, being naturally a clearly smaller guy, and carrying extra weight visibly too. He didn't look terrible or anything like that, but he didn't look rock solid.
He's a short guy. He's not big. He's not big at
No,
all.
well, there's only so many ways you can carry that weight. You know, like
Yeah.
it's
And
only going to go to.
And even as a lightweight, was never known as being Mr. Ripped. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he was in great shape, but no, he wasn't. He wasn't. He was no Edison Miranda. You know what I'm saying?
Nah.
He was no.
He did have like
Yeah.
a tight punch to him, but like he was never really like ripped or defined. And
Yeah,
I mean, he was young, but like, you know what I mean?
he was a very comfortable welterweight. You know, a
Yeah.
very comfortable welterweight.
He already had junior middleweight when he fought Moro. He just looked a little bit more with the velvet trunks.
Well, in like you said, it was just a clear case of overlooking how savvy he was, and how he was going to be able to infight much better with a bigger guy than many people realized, because he's Roberto Duran and that's what he does. But
whatever
I mean,
jitters he had. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that it's, you know, that fight is a fight that I personally really enjoy watching. Like,
A lot of skill on display in it too.
Yeah, and it's a fun fight, but it's a fight where there's a lot of like nip and tuck type of action, where a lot of feinting, a lot of like trap setting and shit like that. It's a really good fight. It's a fun fight to watch.
It's a good fight to watch, an educational fight to watch. And whatever pre-fight jitters or however Hagler was feeling performing against Duran, that was long gone when he got his second super fight against Thomas Hearns.
Yeah, the guys that you mentioned before, Roldan and then Hamsho. Roldan actually gave him a pretty a tough fight, in the sense that he pushed back and he put up some resistance, but he was just
Roldan was a brute.
Yeah, but that's what he was. He was not in a position to. His only chance was going to be able to outmuscle Hagler, and Hagler was a guy who was, you better be pretty rough to outmuscle him, because he just wasn't. He wasn't going to outskill him, and that's pretty much. Yeah, Hagler just overwhelmed his ass.
He turned Roldan's eye into a giant meatball.
Yeah, he made him look absolutely awful, right there in the ring. And then Mustafa Hamsho, the dude you mentioned earlier, another very tough contender that Hagler's just like, nope, you're denied. Sorry, not tonight, buddy. And then by the time he got to Hearns, they had talked about Hagler squaring down with Hearns for like a couple of years.
Yeah, I think back in like '82, I think they were scheduled to fight or talking about it.
That's the crazy thing about the timing with all of this, and that we've mentioned from the beginning here, is that Hagler just had funky timing with his career. That like the stuff about him possibly getting a title shot like in '72 or whatever, that's bunk. But even so, the timing with a lot of the stuff was just he came along at a weird time, and had some of these other guys come along just a few years earlier, we might have seen a different story with some of these fights. Obviously, if he would have fought Leonard a few years earlier, I think that would have been a very different story. And that if we would have fought even Duran a couple of years earlier, I mean, if that would have been possible, different story, et cetera, et cetera. But even so, getting to that second fight, that second super fight, man, when Marvin Hagler died, that was like, it was the first thing people reached to.
Everybody.
Yeah,
and
it's one of the first fights people reach to, period. If you're going to be like, all right, what's one fight you got to show somebody, try to get them into boxing, or entertaining fight, it's going to be like a top three. People are going to go Hagler Hearns.
Yeah.
It's short, it's sweet.
Just because of that first round.
Yeah. From the start. And it's not like the action, there's some clinching and stuff like that after like they get the jitters out, but even so, for a 3-round fight, for like a 2.5 round fight, it's potent.
I mean, it's incredible, man. You have in that first round, you go out there, they just there was no holding back. They just absolutely bombed each other. There was not. I don't think there was a jab thrown in the first round. And that's an actual stat. They just came out bombing. And Hearns wobbled Hagler a little bit, I think, with the right hand. Probably the one that he broke his hand on his head, broke his hand with when he landed a couple of times. Because he said that, didn't he say he broke his hand on Hagler's head?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if he knew exactly what moment. He probably maybe he did.
Yeah.
I don't know because I know he had hand issues previously too.
Uh,
But point is,
that
yeah.
first round was just vicious, man. Like all that pent up
Ugh.
aggression because they, they went on that tour, and that was a long tour, even by boxing standards, where they went all over the country, all these press conferences. You have to see that dude's face every single day. Hagler's the type of person already who doesn't like seeing his opponent and is already bitter and can't stand seeing a guy. So like he doesn't want to deal with this shit. Now Hearns is antagonizing them all the time, every stop of the way, making fun of him, talking junk, whatever it may be. Now you got to deal with that as well. By the time you get to the ring, your head's about to explode, right? And he's like he's just built up with all this rage, and especially when he's at his training camp as well, because he's deep down in Cape Cod, in the middle of absolute nowhere by the beaches where it's negative nothing degrees, and trust me, it's nasty down there. Really, like New England weather is no joke, especially when you want to go by the water, and that's where Hagler was doing his road work. That's like that's some next level shit, and and to have all that pent up in you, yeah, you just explode. He just exploded like an absolute, like a bottle. It just came right at him, and it just created like this beautiful explosion, man. Like two combustible energies came together and made this perfect storm, and it was incredible to see. And to watch that unfold and to watch those two beat the hell out of each other is just like that's what everyone remembers, man. People that watch that, they remember where they were when they watched it, what their reactions were, and they still feel the same way, still get the same goosebumps, all that type of shit. Like it's crazy. And that fight right there is like when you talk about 80s boxing, that's usually the first fight people bring up. Oh yeah, Hagler Hearns, man, 80s. Like it's just that type of event. Most people don't even talk about the second and third rounds. When you talk about that famous photo of Hearns finally collapsing and then being cradled out of the ring and stuff, but that fight is just based off of what happened in that first round.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the that's how good that first round was.
Yeah.
Was that people kind of forget that it cooled down a little bit, but that first round was so crazy that it's like it sticks with you.
There was both guys were hurt. Hagler got cut. It was crazy.
Yeah, well, and that's an extra element of it too, is that if that cut had worsened, who knows, etc. But
Steele did hold. Remember, I think it was in round 3. Steele halted the action to
yeah,
get it checked out, and Hagler was pissed, like really
like
pissed.
you better not. Yeah,
Oh yeah, he was. He was like, "Not that." You can tell he was like cussing him out. "What the fuck you doing? Like, let me go."
yeah. I got the momentum, motherfucker. What are you doing?
Yeah. It was the same thing, I think, when he was when during the Mugabe round 6 in the Mugabe fight, which is a ridiculous round in itself as well. And Hagler had the momentum briefly, and he came in and he was like bouncing like some crazy shots in Mugabe's dome. And I forgot who was the referee. It was Mills Lane. And Mills Lane, I think, tried to break him up, and he's pushing Hagler back, and you can see Hagler like, "What the hell are you doing? Get off of me!"
He was a scary ass dude. He wasn't gonna give you any room to breathe at all, and that was the story against Hearns. Is that Hearns was a better infighter than he gets credit for being,
Yeah.
but that was not his strength. He needed extension to get full power on his punches, and he wasn't really able to get it. I mean, in one way, stylistically, trying to tap into the analytical blah 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 of boxing for a moment, you obviously, when you have a guy coming toward you and you do have power, that's going to aid in your power because that's aiding in the momentum. Like your punch is going toward him, he's coming toward you, boom. So in a way, that's good, but at the same time, Hagler knew that he knew what distance not to be at, especially after taking that right hand earlier in the first round that appeared to shake him up. I mean, not a lot of fighters stood up to that right hand. Period. Hearns was a dude where he wasn't knocking everybody out, but most fighters he was catching like that, he was knocking out because he had that kind of power. He was just really skilled too. A lot of people forget that. Yeah, Hearns could pop, but he had a lot of skill. Dude was a really good boxer. He wasn't a puncher earlier on in his career. So anyway, Hagler didn't allow him that room. As after he got cracked with that right hand, he was up in his face and was not letting him get away. And that, I don't know if you believe Manny Stewart, it was a combination of Vaseline on the legs was Vlad Klitschko. No, it was the leg massage, the pre-fight leg massage that ruined Tommy's legs or fucked up his legs or something, and he couldn't go and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I think it was mostly just that Hagler was up on his ass for 3 straight rounds, and Hearns thought he could take him out and realized he couldn't and was done.
Oh, yeah. Basically, he just came once Hearns couldn't hold him up and his hand was gone, and Hagler really pushed him on. It was only a matter of time, and then Hearns just evaporated. But
yeah, I don't blame him.
Yeah.
He gave everything he had, and it just wound up being a shorter fight than everybody
those
thought.
3 rounds were worth about 50 rounds worth of action.
No shit.
It was crazy. But what that fight also brought Hagler was finally he got the worldwide respect and adulation he had been craving since he turned pro. Like, he became that star in boxing, because in 1985, Mike Tyson had just turned pro, so obviously he wasn't the star he was to become. Muhammad Ali was retired. Sugar Ray Leonard was retired at the time. Larry Holmes was never Mr. Popular to begin with, so that wasn't gonna, So Marvin Hagler became the face of boxing at that point. And he became, when you talk about 80s television, he was synonymous in the mid-80s with being on a lot of stuff. I remember when I was a kid, before I even knew anything about boxing, I used to watch Punky Brewster, and I saw an episode of him on it when he was Punky had some issue with bullies or something, and Marvin, taught her how to box. That was a great episode.
There's a little training montage and everything.
Yeah. No idea who he was, but I remember watching that as a kid in the 80s. That famous deodorant commercial.
I knew the commercial more than I didn't even know who he was. I knew the commercial, the
sports stick, yeah. One's not humorous, one's chums.
Yep. Yeah. I knew that commercial.
The right guard sports stick. That's what it was, right guard.
Yeah. He obviously had gained popularity. Yep.
And that Pizza Hut commercial is hilarious too, because the way he eats the pizza is like, I had a couple of women who I showed it to, they laughed and they said it looked like Hagler was like, I don't know, it was like provocative the way he ate it, and they said it was almost like a turn on.
All right, then. Well,
I was just like, wait, what the hell? I mean, no, but the way he did is really funny. He sits there and he smiles. He was like, "Hey, mom," like eating this. But Hagler had that way about him, man. He came full circle. Everybody loved him, in the sport. He was featured on late night television. He was featured on television commercials, this, that. You saw him, always mentioned wherever he went. Adulation. Hagler was that guy.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's some question as to how much the fame and celebrity that he had been. I mean, I don't know how much he had necessarily been craving celebrity or fame.
But just being the respect for the, recognition. Yeah. And he was recognized basically as the baddest and the best fighter on the planet.
And so I don't know if that got to him. I don't know if that got to his head. I don't know if that made him comfortable. But even he said that it was difficult. Yeah, the silk.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
You're just about to say. Even he said the whole silk pajamas quote or whatever it was. It's difficult
to get up for road work when you're wearing silk pajamas. Yep.
Which is just like true, And I think that also maybe he was speaking to his own experience, that it was nice being recognized and that he was maybe getting comfortable, and also, like I said, he was coming toward the end of his career. He was not young, and he had gone through 60, maybe 50 something, maybe 60 something fights at this point,
Tough
and
fight.
tough
Yeah.
fights, yeah, difficult fights, in constantly traveling around, going to other people's hometowns, and you get put in with a dude like John Mugabe, who was relentless in his own right, who was not given Hagler an inch and was intent on spoiling the parade and almost did.
I mean, the Beast was an absolute monster. There's that famous Ring magazine cover of his from '84 before he fought Hagler, where they give the list of all of his opponents and all by knockouts, and he's like growling for the camera.
Yep.
Yeah, and look up his highlights, man. Before he fought Hagler, he was an absolute animal in the ring. I mean, he wasn't out there wild and crazy, just swinging from the fences like Louis Firpo type shit, but like, because he had skill to him. If he didn't have any skill to him, there was no way he was going to last as long as he did with Hagler and give him hell like that. Hagler would have took his ass out early because Hagler ate up, big punchers. But Mugabe was a guy who had skill, knew how to box, and just wasn't who could punch your brains out and just had ridiculous power. And when he hurt you, he took you out. Frank the Animal
Yeah.
Fletcher, Curtis Parker, a bunch of other middleweights, really, really good middleweights from that era who just were evaporated in like one round or less against Mugabe. So for him to fight Hagler, man, and then when he fought Hagler, that was I think that was also the fight was postponed too because Hagler like suffered a broken nose or something in sparring. Like Hagler was out of the ring for a while before he finally got in there with Mugabe.
And he was coming off a very incredible fight. Might have only been 3 rounds, but
Yeah.
you see the post-fight interviews for like a couple weeks. The dude was bandaged up. He was still swollen. That was only 3 rounds, man. So clearly it was, and the Mugabe fight, it went 10, 11 rounds. So these
And
were tough
Mugabe gave
fights.
him hell. Yeah, like it was one of those fights that Hagler was, you know, Hagler was in control. He was winning the fight on the judges' scorecards by a couple of points. But Mugabe was with Hagler for a lot of the way before he finally wilted and just finally collapsed. Kind of like most Hagler opponents do. They just have nothing left to give. They just collapse. He landed more punches on Hagler that would have taken out most, if not the entire division, the way he was landing them. I mean, he was landing some hellacious shots. Like again, that 6th round that I mentioned, where they went toe to toe for 3 minutes. Mugabe landed some right hands and hooks and stuff that he bounced off Hagler's head that you just see him like they just thudding punches, man. And some fight during the fight he outboxed Hagler a little bit in a couple of stretches. Like it wasn't, Hagler was only ahead by like 2 points on the scorecards. It was close, and it was really, and that fight took a lot out of Hagler. It took a lot out of Mugabe too. He was never the same after that fight. But Hagler definitely had lost a step. The Mugabe fight probably definitely added to that step a little bit more, and that's what convinced Sugar Ray Leonard that now is the time to step back and challenge Hagler.
Yeah, like if fighting Marvin Hagler was kind of like somebody swinging an axe at, like it ain't gonna kill you with one, but it's like chopping you down. But
Yeah, and it's like, you can't hurt the guy. Like, you take out a pistol and shoot him, that's all they're going to do is just piss him off. Like,
yeah, and well, like he's just chopping at you. Like the whole, it might not chop you in two, but it's slowly chopping your ass down.
Mm-hmm.
But then a guy like Mugabe was a little bit more explosive and a little bit more like he had a sledgehammer, and at the end of the sledgehammer was some gunpowder. It was like blap, hit you, and it was like fuck. But that's the thing, is that it's the whole unstoppable force versus immovable object thing, and Hagler wound up winning out because he was just steadier and had the chin. And if he didn't have that chin, if he didn't know how to take punches too, if he weren't good at tucking his chin and taking shots like on the top of his head and shit like that, or on his elbows, on his forearms, he might have lost against John Mugabe that night, but he didn't.
I mean,
And
Mugabe fought the best fight of his career probably was that night.
And there are a number of fighters where you could say stuff like that, where their greatest achievement might have been a loss. And there's not anything wrong with that. It's just like, especially when it's against a guy like Marvin Hagler, there ain't nothing wrong with his performance against Marvin Hagler.
Absolutely not. No.
extremely proud. He was undefeated, and if that's his first loss, fuck it, baby, it's all good. But like you said, that performance and that visible slippage, he hadn't fought in almost a year, and then Ray Leonard specifically kept his ass out for for over a year until he finally, they finally got together. And I mean, there was hurdles along the way, and Ray Leonard had retired something like 6 times by that time. I mean, dude, he even said before he turned pro,
That number seems low, actually.
He probably might have been more. He even said
Who knows?
before he turned pro, he even said he wasn't going to turn pro and that he was going to retire as an amateur.
He retired after the Olympics. That's right.
So I mean, like, dude, it was literally it was meant to be the entire time. And that's why a lot of people, I think, I have no problem with Ray Leonard, but I think that's why a lot of people dislike Ray Leonard and the whole, Fab Four equation, because he seems kind of like the most manufactured of the four. But in any case, that's kind of also the prevailing. That's what Hagler felt. That's, I think, the prevailing opinion, the consensus that Ray Leonard. Well, and I think Ray Leonard's even flat out said that shit, dude. That he wanted him to fucking be old, and he wanted him to lose a step before he got in there with him.
Well, Hagler. I think we've talked about on the show before. Hagler was already, Hagler was already dissed by Ray back in the day. Remember, that big press conference that Ray held that no one knew what it was about. He invites Hagler.
It's a big announcement.
The big announcement, and Hagler thought it was going to be to challenge him for the middleweight title. And this fight will never happen. Good night. He bring what? I mean, if I was Hagler, I would have decked him right there.
Yeah, that's a
clowned him. He absolutely clowned him. Like,
that's a total dick move.
Yeah, he clowned the shit out of him, and I think even Ray felt bad about it years later. He mentioned that he was like, "Yeah, that was a dick move on my part. I shouldn't have done that." Like,
well, and I mean, now we know, I think, a more complete.
What was going on in his life? Yeah, but
it's tough to say. I mean, I'm obviously biased. Tommy Hearns is my favorite fighter. Hagler is one of my favorite fighters. I love Duran. Ray Leonard, I never had a problem with him. He's just not one of my favorites, really. But it's tough to even know, like, what he's saying, how much of it is true. Because even to this day, a lot of the stuff that he says and it almost sounds scripted. Like, it sounds like he's an actor saying it or something like that, and it's weird. Maybe that's just the way he talks and his delivery and shit, but point being, we now know that dude was running through mad coke. He was, I don't know how much alcohol he was drinking. I don't know that he was ever really an alcoholic, but I know he was partying, and he was definitely into the party scene and shit like that. And point is, I'm not surprised that he would pull a dick move like that, but that doesn't make it any less of a dick move. And so all of these things in conjunction, lead up to the fight, Ray's kind of dismissing Hagler, which I guess, that's what he should have been doing. But he knew that everything that he was doing was pissing Hagler off, and that would be his best chance to win the fight. And that's unfortunately kind of how it played out, in my opinion. And I know that's kind of an unpopular opinion to say that you think Ray Leonard maybe won that fight, but a whole number of things. Hagler fought the wrong fight for too many rounds. He started too late. He kind of bought into a lot of Ray Leonard's antics and tricks, started clowning back, all that type of shit, and it didn't help him. He should have been pressuring from the beginning. He should have been punching while Ray was punching. He should have been pushing him back into the corner and just hook into the body like he was trying to fucking decapitate his ass or, disembowel him, whatever. But he didn't. He bought it too much into the bullshit and did the exact same thing that Roberto Duran did in the rematch. Kind of, he let him get into his head. And that's, I don't know. A lot of people disagree. A lot of people still feel Hagler clearly beat him, but
first time I ever saw a clip of that fight was on SummerSlam, of all things, the very first SummerSlam.
That's crazy.
Because Vince McMahon's only foray into boxing, besides, bringing Mike Tyson to WrestleMania, McMahon's only foray into boxing, like promoting boxing, he promoted Sugar Ray Leonard, Donnie Lalonde.
Yeah, that's right.
Before the fight, it was like he didn't do bad with it. You know, he brought Sugar Ray on to Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, like messed with him, you know, all that other stuff. But while they kept on running highlights when I was watched SummerSlam 1 and I had a video of it, and they kept on running highlights throughout the show of Leonard Lalonde, you know, of highlights of him, and they would show that one. They kept on showing the one highlight of Leonard with his back to the ropes, and when he lands, you know, that flurry to Hagler's head.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the music they would add to it though, they went bop, 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 like the, you know, to kind of like go with the sequence of how he landed the punches, like totally 80s cheesy shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like you don't know if it's like promo music or porno music.
Yeah. But they added it perfectly as like the highlight, bop, 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 like, you know, and then it was like Leonard. Then they show Lalonde, bow, 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 Lalonde, you know, and then But I was like, what the hell is Sugar Ray Leonard, and why does he keep showing up on my TV like when I was a kid? So, as I saw that fight too, I'm a person who loves Hagler, and as a person who grew up in New England, I'm not allowed to say this, but I think Leonard beat him. So, I've said that before too, and I've explained my reasons for that on the show.
Yeah, it pretty much comes down to what I said. I think he just fought the wrong fight. You know, there was a lot of.
He came on, he landed a lot of good stuff, but like his flurries that he landed weren't eye-catching either, where he had like Leonard reeling or about to like fall over, or, you know, Leonard was doubled over and about to be stopped or something. It wasn't anything like that. No. He did a lot of really consistent good work, but Leonard still, and I'm not saying this is what wins a fight all the time, but Leonard was able to land the more eye-catching stuff to the judges, to the public, to everything, you know, and that's what got everyone's attention, because Leonard supposedly was not supposed to be doing any of this. You know, and he was over, you know, he was overreaching and doing better than anyone expecting, and, you know, it was a beautiful performance and whatever. So, but that, you know, the one scorecard though, that of course ruins everything, kind of like the 117-111 this past weekend with Estrada.
Exactly.
Yeah, you had Jojo Guevara's card of 118-110. And that's, you know, that's a FU. That's like a total, let me just write this up, I'm not even watching the fight. And a guy like Marvin Hagler didn't deserve that. You know what I mean? That disgusted him. Hagler would have retired probably after this fight if he had won it, but he was so disgusted by everything that went down with it, especially a card like that, that's such a slap in the face to him, that he was done.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, there's a totally legitimate discussion that perhaps needs to be had about whether or not the way that boxing is scored should still be scored, you know, whether boxing should still be scored that way, because you can come up with some pretty funky scores. You can have and we've talked about this a number of times before as far as how fights can be scored and stuff like that, but you can have a fight where every single round is really close, but one guy barely takes it. So you have a really close nip and tuck fight where on the cards it's a domination, because each round was really close, but one guy was just a little better, or one person was just a little better. I don't want to discount the women's boxing here, but point is, maybe there is a discussion that needs to be had that, like, we need to totally revamp boxing scoring or whatever. Maybe not, I don't know. But the point is that when you score the way that you're supposed to score round by round, I'm not saying that I love the tactic of stealing rounds, quote unquote. I'm not saying that it's my favorite thing ever. Oh, he was real savvy to do that. It's true, but it's just, it just is. You know, if the rules are set that way, Ray Leonard kind of like exploited the rules, and that's what it is. Yeah. And I agree. I think that he probably won that fight, and I don't really see it ever getting closer for Hagler than like 7-5 for Ray.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly. But
it's not a domination by Ray Leonard either. It's not something where I'd be walking around going, I kicked his ass. He didn't kick his ass. He slapped him to death for, you know, a number of the rounds. That's all. But that wound up being enough to hope, whatever. I don't want to beat the dead horse. Point being, that's a pretty shitty way to have to go out for Hagler. And so I understand him going.
And Hagler had to concede a lot of things too. Instead of it being 15 rounds, he had to go to 12 rounds. I think they made it a bigger ring, right? That they so Leonard was able to move around in that. J.D. Brown, who was a Leonard associate, and a well-known DC area trainer and manager, snuck into the Hagler camp and watched him and to record an event and took notes of Hagler sparring and stuff like that. Went in undercover as a disguise and everything. A bunch of shit happened with that fight. Hagler had a lot going against him, and
That's true, and that was part of the whole delay and buildup, was that Ray Leonard wanted the lion's share, and he wanted to make all the rules and everything like that. And I think that initially Hagler probably didn't want to concede too much, but then finally was just like, fuck it, I'm going to whoop this guy's ass. Who cares?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
It was just, there were a lot of things going against him. His age, how much of his career he'd already gone through, the fact that Ray Leonard, while, retired however many times, was still probably a fresher guy in terms of how much punishment he'd taken. And, the list, really goes on. So I don't blame him, for a guy who felt for much of his career that so many things were going against him. And then in his final fight, which is a massive fight, concede so much and then lose by such a small margin. And then on top of that, be kind of heckled into come on, Marvin, let's rematch. I'd be like, bro, fuck you, man. What the fuck? No way. And that's pretty much what he did. He ran off to Italy and was like, I'm about to star in action movies, bitch. Get out of here. That's what he did.
He did, yeah. There was a lot of speculation, as was with Michael Spinks, but not as much, about Hagler coming back all the time. Ring Magazine covers and other boxing magazine covers. Is Hagler coming back? Is Hagler coming back? I know there was a couple of times it was kind of close where he thought, this was going to be it. I guess, to fight Leonard in a rematch or so. But nah, Hagler stuck to his guns and he never came back. And I'm not sure if this is true or not, but it's been said, and I think he said it, that he never put on another pair of gloves after that. At least to work out or train or spar or whatever. Yeah. I don't know. But Hagler, like you said, he resisted the temptation and came back. He moved to Italy, starred in, action movies out there and stuff. But he always kept to his New England roots too, and that's one thing about Hagler that has to be mentioned, why he was always so adored in New England, is that even though he moved to Italy, it wasn't like he just kind of moved there like a jazz musician back in the day and just kind of, besides once or twice coming back to the States for a quick visit, he just, primarily stay out there. No, Hagler would go to Italy half the year and then stay in his New Hampshire home the other half. And the reason why I chose New Hampshire, he loved skiing, he loved doing things like that. And trust me, New Hampshire is plenty of that going on over there. So that was his thing. But it has to be mentioned that a guy like Hagler, how he affected someone like me when I was a kid is that, growing up in the New England, in New Bedford and New England in the 90s, when I started boxing and getting involved in gyms and stuff, Hagler was talked about in hushed tones by people, whether they were involved in boxing or just fans or anything. Hagler was universally loved by these fans because he was on par to maybe not quite Larry Bird, but he was a franchise in New England, and Hagler would always still fighting. He had plenty of fights in New England, even when he was champion. He still fought in Providence, Rhode Island. He still fought in Worcester. He still fought in the Boston Garden. He still fought and brought the title home. So it was almost like a homecoming game for the Celtics. It would be like a homecoming game for a Hagler fight to come, to watch him at the Garden beat the hell out of somebody. And he meant a lot to a lot of people because he would always be around. He was an accessible guy. He didn't try to shy away or anything. Even when he became big, he was accessible. He was always at his various stores and other businesses that he took care of in New England. So he was kind of in the sense that Larry Holmes was always around at his places in Easton. And so a lot of people in New England and all over always have their own personal Marvin Hagler story to tell or something. For me, he used to train at the Boys and Girls Club sometimes, the same one that I started training at when I was a kid. And my trainer, who's long since passed, his main fighter was a guy who I've mentioned on the show named Andre McCoy. And Andre McCoy was one of the top amateurs back in the late 70s before he died in that tragic plane crash to Poland. And so Hagler used to come down to the Boys and Girls Club to spar McCoy, and vice versa. They go to Brockton to go spar at Hagler's gym. But, Hagler had a lot of ties to New Bedford. My dad talked to him about Marvin Hagler, about my old trainer, Mr. Vincent, and training in New Bedford. He was like, "Oh yeah, Bucky, man, he was a great guy." We recorded him video because Mr. V was ailing at the time, and we recorded a video of him. Hey, Bucky, you're still my buddy. Miss you. We had a lot of good memories, stuff like that. Like, Hagler was a good dude, man. And to say he was adored at the Hall of Fame, bro, would be an understatement. I cannot tell you. I've never seen a fighter. I never saw Ali there. So I don't know, the reaction to him must have been incredible. But besides Mike Tyson, I have never seen a fighter get mobbed the way Marvin Hagler was mobbed each year by everybody. Like, everyone just swarmed to him. And he was always the last person who was usually introduced in the ring at the Hall of Fame, too, because of that. Because he always got the loudest reaction. Hagler was just universally loved by everybody. All fighters respected him because you just knew the stories of his work ethic, the way he fought, the way he took care of himself, everything, his mannerisms, and fans just loved him for the same reasons, basically.
Well, I don't want to be that guy, but I guess I sometimes do wind up having to be that guy. Just in the interest of not fawning too much, or painting, in the interest of painting a complete picture too. Marvin Hagler did have a few issues outside the ring that started actually immediately after that Ray Leonard fight.
Oh yeah. His,
and I mean,
divorce, wives, other stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yes. His wife. Well,
it's actually a funny story. That's why I'm laughing. It's not funny, but
yeah, I mean, it's not funny, but like, I didn't know the details, and when I read the details, I was like, it's crazy funny, not actual funny.
Exactly.
But you'll understand when I say it now if you're listening and you're like, what the fuck are you saying, bro? So apparently Marvin Hagler, I don't know when his problem had started. Perhaps he had been into cocaine and alcohol for a while. I truly don't know. I honestly don't. But apparently he had some cocaine and alcohol issues immediately following that Ray Leonard loss. He did not take that loss very well. It wasn't an issue where he was like, well, fuck it, I'll go to Italy. It was like he raged on some drugs and shit for a bit. And what that wound up meaning for his wife, who he was with at the time, she said that he got physical with her. I don't know the specifics. All that I saw in the newspaper report was that he threw her out of the house, like physically threw her out of the house, and then threw a boulder at her car.
Yep.
I mean,
you told me that story the other day.
I just don't. It's not funny because that's domestic violence, but who the fuck throws a boulder? God damn! I guess Marvin Hagler throws a boulder. So
that was Bertha, right?
Yes, that was. If you actually look up, there's photos of he and his wife, and that wife. Because if you look up older photos of he and his wife, it'll be Bertha almost all the time. There aren't that many, contemporary photos because he was, if they are, they'd be on his social media, but they weren't really in like the spotlight like that. Because you said he maintained his New England roots, and he did. He had a house in, I want to say, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Because he was in Brockton or around Brockton. But then not too long, I guess, after the domestic violence thing, he had sold his house or did something and wound up getting a house in New Hampshire. And that was where he had kind of set up shop apart from Italy. And so he had a house in New Hampshire. And I think that's where he was, or where he was going from when he died. Yeah, so anyway, like I said, I don't mean to, I'm not trying to be a dick and be like, oh, we just said all this good things about this guy, and now he was an asshole, here's what he did. But the point is, he did have some issues stemming from that Leonard fight, and he actually later had a DUI too, but just saying.
Yeah, he had definitely the Leonard fight deeply affected. I mean, it's just the way it ended for him, for a guy who achieved so much, he built everything he did, just to have it snatched away from him like that was just like, a slap in the face. And for a person as proud as he was, a person as proud as he was, then definitely it's not going to be an easy pill to swallow.
And that's one of those things where it's like a metaphor for boxing, like boxing's harsh. It treats you like shit. And,
Chews
you
you up
find
and spits you out. Yep, when you're not useful anymore.
you finally reach the peak. You're finally a celebrity and a superstar, and you're pound for pound level, and then just
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
boxing loves doing that shit to you. That's the thing. So, but that's.
Go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead, please.
Oh, but it's with him passing though, it just leaves a crazy gap because, with the '70s heavyweights passing away over the past few years, more of them dropping and stuff. It's like, yeah, they're not even old themselves really, but kind of understandable as they get into their 70s and things like the way their careers went, how long they fought and stuff, their bodies start breaking down. So you get it. But a guy like Hagler was still young. He was still really young, and he looked like he was still in like peak health, at least, for his age. Just last year, he posted up that he was doing a bike ride for like over 50 miles and stuff, So when guys like Ali and Frazier and Norton and stuff pass away, I kind of get it because like they're older and they were whatever state of health they were in, but Hagler looked healthy, and he's still young. Leonard is still in incredible shape. Duran got back in really good shape. Hearns, looks good for himself. So now one of them is gone. It's just kind of like, holy shit, you know what I mean? Like I don't know. It's like it hits hard. It's kind of like a wow, like that era it's happening now. Hopefully not again for many, many years after this, but it's still kind of like wow, one of the kings is now gone. Which brings me to my other quick point is that even before Hagler's passing, it's starting to get really popular again for all these, for boxing people to keep on trying to make comparisons. Oh, these are the new four kings. These are the new four kings. Whether it's with the lightweights who are never going to fight each other, or the current round robin going on with Chocolatito and Estrada, Sorung Vasai, and so on. But as good as those series of fights has been between those guys and whatever the lightweights are gonna do with themselves, it's almost like, why would you compare it to that? Like, why are boxing people so quick to try to like always compare things? Just let them stand on their own. Nothing will compare to what Hagler, Hearns, Leonard, and Duran did for various reasons. It wasn't just the fights that they produced. There was so much more than that.
Well, and that's one of the ironic things about that too is some of the people who whine the most about how boxing is not how it used to be are the promoters who refuse to let them stand on their own and continue to, this is going to be the Hagler Hearns of this. It's like, fuck, dude,
Yeah.
No, it is not. No, it won't.
How many times was a De La Hoya fight back in the 90s when it was going to be against Corte or Trinidad or this one or that one? It was supposed to be Leonard Hearns all over again. And
Right.
Not one of them not one of them even came close to it.
It's like, no, it's not, dude. No, it isn't. And that's okay. But I mean, yeah, and that's actually what I was going to say too when we were both like, no, you go on, was that the other day when we talked, like right after we found out Hagler died, I think I said it was kind of like the Purnell, like when Purnell died, because it was a little bit more, and forgive me for saying it, but it was a little more like understandable or a little bit more predictable because Purnell had gone through so many issues to where it was like, it wasn't fully unexpected. It was mostly the way that it happened. And similarly, anyway, that's what was so unbelievable is that Marvin Hagler was in great shape. The second I saw it, like I saw it moments before you sent me a message, and I was like, whoa, no, like somebody fucked up. And one of the first things I said was that, he just posted a photo a couple days ago and he looked great. He looked in great shape. He always sounded coherent. He always sounded like he was doing well financially, and not that that's necessarily an indicator of health or anything, but it's just he seemed like he was in a great position. And yeah, it very much came out of the blue. I'm not going to harp about this part. I'm only going to mention it once, and I'll try to keep it brief because there's no point in spending a lot of time on it. But it is fucking shameful that anybody used Marvin Hagler's death for some sort of weird anti-vaccination or anything agenda. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because it's like, fuck those people. But anyway, super shameful. And
It's definitely hijacked.
You should be ashamed of yourself if you did that. But I mean, it was sudden, and shit was surprising and awful. And anyway, I think that's what's really been lost. That's something that's really tough to impart because you can't like measure it. You can't see it. You don't know for sure. And I've mentioned this we haven't been as steady with the shows, but the last few shows we've done, I've kind of said something that the boxing people that we've lost in the last year to coronavirus, the vast majority of them were like 60 to 80. You know, some of them were a little bit older than that. But the point is, a lot of these people had been in boxing a long time. They knew a lot of people. They went through a lot of things. They saw a lot of stuff, trained a lot of fighters, trained with a lot of fighters, made a lot of deals, so forth. And so when you add that up, I mean, there's no way to really add it up. But when you add it up, you can't measure what's been lost. And it's similar with Marvin Hagler. Like, you can't measure what's been lost. And like you always say, that's why it's like you got to get at these dudes now. And these women who were also, you know, these women fighters who were part of history too, you got to get at them now. You have to talk with them now and hear these things now, because when they're lost, they're gone, and you just can't get it back.
No, it's like you just mentioned. Once people, that's why, you know, I'm so thankful about going to the hall when I did as a kid again, just to meet all the people I had a chance to meet, interact with them and stuff, and hear their stories.
Yeah, it's going to be a gnarly bash next year, and so it's like as soon as stuff's available,
hopefully,
snag it.
I have no idea how they're going to pull that off. But
well, everything's kind of opening back up, and I fear we're gonna. Well, anyway, let's put our fingers crossed and get them together, and hopefully we'll be able to.
There's so many people. That's what I'm trying to figure out, how they're gonna do it, how they're gonna handle it.
Oh, bro!
So many
it's such
people.
a small.
They might have to
facility,
open up another small pavilion somewhere, like build one that they did at Caesars back in the day.
Well, I mean, it's gotten big enough. I know they don't have a lot of money, but it's gotten big enough that if they had a larger facility, they could fill it.
Yeah, because with 3 classes going in, the amount of people that are going to show up and the fans is, the whole world. I mean, the whole Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's going to be nutty, but I mean, point being, unfortunately, it's going to have to be.
Right now.
Unfortunately, it's going to have to be minus Marvin Hagler, but there's going to be.
Oh, that's just a huge loss, man, for that. Like, to think that next year, when God willing the Hall of Fame gets back to normal, that Leon Spinks and Marvin Hagler are not going to be there is like just gutting.
Yeah, it's a pretty big loss for not just boxing, but also that celebration, you know, given, like you said, how big he was for that celebration. But it's not to say, that's not to slight any other fighter that's going to be part of that celebration, or any other fighter who's still alive and part of history. They all play their part, but still, it's going to be a pretty big gap, and having to kind of mourn that while there is not going to be easy either. But in the meanwhile, you know, remembering his career, luckily we're able to go on to places like YouTube and we're able to watch a number of his fights and see history right there. Just do that. Just celebrate his career, and yeah, I mean, hopefully everybody enjoyed the show and learned a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. It was great to talk about him, great to reminisce about his career and the life of the man, and hope everyone enjoyed it.
For sure, man. Well, I'm sure we will be back as soon as humanly possible with some other history stuff and even some contemporary stuff. But in the meanwhile, if you like this history podcast business, go ahead and subscribe to Knuckles and Gloves Boxing Radio. You can go on to Apple, iTunes, whatever that thing is called at this point. I think it's just Apple Podcasts, but Spotify, Stitcher, all of those things. We're on all of those platforms, so very easy to subscribe and rate us. But also, if you're on social media, go on to Twitter, for instance, and follow Aris Pina there at Punch Zone Aris, A-R-I-S, and follow me, Patrick Connor, at Patrick M. Connor. And if you're on Facebook, there's a Knuckles and Gloves Boxing Radio page there too. And that's about it, man. Aris, we'll talk soon, my friend.
It was a pleasure, man. Talk to you later.
All right, take it easy, everybody.